So I thought I'd mention real quick, kind of the area that I come from. So while I have training as an information scientist, as well as in the IT realm, so I kind of cross two borders here. Of one, the library and information science, managing data, helping people manage data, describing data, cataloging data, and the other on the IT side as well. So I have a wide range of backgrounds. I come from, on the next slide, I come from the Odum Institute. A little bit of background on that Odum Institute. The Odum Institute is a social science research institute. And it's on that, the next slide there, Emrys. The Odum, Odum runs this research science institute here, but at UNC Chapel Hill. But one thing to note is that it is very interdisciplinary. We work all across the public health sector, the medical sector, the political science sector. School of Public Health, as I mentioned before, is one of our really big customers. Planning, city and regional planning as well. Geography we work with. So it's a very interdisciplinary. We deal with all different types of data, which puts us at a unique place within our university where we can help describe and manage data across many different areas. So you know, following up on all the great speakers so far that have said a lot of great things, I want to think about one in particular on the next slide. Is think about this as research data management. What's the difference in research data? Why research data is a little different than just storing something on a laptop or backing it up and preserving it. The one question, I have a few questions I'd like you to think about while we talk here. The first is context. If you're looking at your context of that data, what's involved in that? What is in the context? What is curation? A lot of people don't even know what the word curation means. They hear data management and they hear people talk about curation, but what are some of the tasks with curation and why is it different with research data management? Everyone knows how to cite documents. The academic world is fueled by citations within documents, but citing and giving proper credit for research output such as databases or data sets is something we need to think about and we need to plan and manage for. The last thing I want to talk about is why you really need diversity. Why do you need diversity in building these data management teams, and how it's a little different for research data than it would be standard file formats that many people know how to deal with on a daily basis. So the next screen. Context is really important. So what would you need to do to reproduce your own research? Think back through your latest research project or a research project you're planning if you're a student, or if you're a librarian, the last research project that you assisted a researcher with. If you had to start from scratch and do it all over, not for someone else, but for yourself, if you just had to reinvent everything and start from the beginning, think back through all the components that you had to go through, all the small changes you did without documenting them, without writing them down, what it would take to just reproduce your own research. And then think about, now you have to share it with someone else. You have to share it with a colleague that you're on a new grant with, that you're going to leverage some of the great data and great work you did on a new project. So you need to share that with that collaborator. Or it may be someone that you don't know that is interested in your research and wants to take a look at your research. How would you share that? How would you describe them? What would your first steps be? So think about that context of all those components that it took to produce that data and to do that analysis. In many cases, there's lots of components that are instruments involved, whether they be telescopes or whether they be things that scan fluids like in fluid cytometry, or different types of microscopes that have different types of filters and different types of software and different versions of software and different types of tools, software tools that are used within each of these instruments to produce the data, or something as simple as a survey. And many surveys are not so simple, but let's say a survey, you had a challenge getting a good sample, and you knew the demographics of the region, but you had to weight some of your data because you couldn't get an even sample across the whole population. So you weighted some of that data. Did you document that well? How do you document that? How would you inform everyone that that's what you did? So in the next slide, I also want people to think broadly about data, right? Data is not necessarily just the output of an instrument in a lab, right? People are data, objects are data, places, space, time, relationships, concepts and ideas, all of these things are data. And as we see that the work around data gets more and more complex, all of these concepts get harder and harder to describe and to detail. So on the next slide. So research formats are evolving. Imagine just in one area. We do a lot in the quantitative area. And when I first began many years ago, Stata was really popular, and everyone used Stata. Then SPSS and SAS became very, very strong in the statistical analysis section. And there's many different versions. Companies bought out SPSS, for example. IBM bought out SPSS, changed the formats. Older versions don't work in the newer software. Now, many people are using R and Python to do statistical analysis. So over just in my tenure as an archivist and dealing with data, I have seen many types of data formats within just one quantitative field change from those different types of formats. And it makes it much harder. These data are also becoming increasing in size. They're not only large as far as volume, as far as one single file might be multiple terabytes now, if it includes GIS data or video data potentially. But in addition, there's many small files. Sometimes it's not one big file, but it's many small files, many folders. We've ran into a couple situations managing data where the folder structure was too large to be able to be stored and to be able to manage as that one structure. So there's many things that can cause something to be large or more complex to deal with. In addition, there are many more difficulties with de-identifying data, and we'll talk a little bit about sensitive data farther in the presentation. But typically, people de-identify data and remove identifications, but that's getting much harder, especially with geolocating data and data that's very dynamic. For example, we're collecting cell phone data for analysis during this COVID crisis. And we get data every day. More and more data come in faster and faster. So we have to find an automated way to de-identify those things. One thing that makes this stuff even more challenging is collaborating with other data, merging different types of data. So this is why data management is important, because you not only want to discover that data, but you need to interpret it and reuse it. So the idea here is that data is a first-class citizen, and all of the components around the data are really important to understand it in order to interpret that data and to be able to reuse it for yourself primarily, but also for other folks as well. So the goal of data management should be to sustain that value of the data. You want the data to hold its value. And that means today, tomorrow, next year, and on into the future for a longer term, because you spend a lot of resources. A university or a research group spend lots and lots of time, effort, and money developing these data sets, and they should be leveraged as an asset into the future. And to do that, we need to look at the ability to manage this over the long term, not just during your research project, but after the funding ends, and who can manage this on an ongoing basis after the funding ends. So next slide. So curation process. So when we think about a curation process, what does that mean? What does this word curate mean? So I like to think of curation as an active process, talking about that creating preservable formats. So for example, in that previous example I gave of those SPSS files that were older versions, and the newer version of SPSS won't read those. We should create new, we call them surrogates, but create surrogates for these files. So you have not only the original file, which is really important because that's the original file that everything came from and archived and preserved, but you also want a surrogate that's able to use with current formats. A term that we use to talk about this is their designated community. What tools, what software, and what access does your designated community need to that data? So if I'm providing a service to provide this data into the future, I'll need to actively curate that, change it over time. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, may last for 15, but eventually I'm going to have to migrate that data from one format into another. In my experience, just at Odum Institute, we've had to do this several times. I've even participated in the early on migration from EBCDIC standard data off the mainframes into ASCII data that were on Unix boxes and mini computers. So even the basic encoding of the data has changed in my tenure at the Odum Institute. I could see that many changes over the long term, once you start talking 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, as far as basic encoding, but we even see it much more rapid in research analysis software, and especially the software that runs the instruments. In many cases, the telescopes that do this microscopy are connected to Windows-based machines, and these Windows-based machines run a set of software. These machines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're powered by the software on these Windows computers, basically powerful desktop computers connected to these microscopes. That software is a limiting factor. You have to manage that software. As new microscopes come on board, you need new software. But this old data was collected in the old system is still valuable. You want to compare it to current use. Longitudinal studies across old data and new data are really important in the research world. So we need to think about how we do that. How do you describe that data? How are we going to discuss all these different changes we made? Cleaning data. How are you going to describe that cleaning of the data? I have a current project right now where we are collected a huge amount of data, very large data in the 4 to 5 terabyte range of judicial data from the court systems. And we get an update every 6 months. But those updates also include some things that need to be cleaned in the old data. So we're actively cleaning, creating new records. That stuff needs to be described in a metadata format that can be machine readable and explainable to the next person that uses it. But those are really important processes that are ongoing, not only during the early life cycle of the research, but even after the projects are over. So next. The idea here is to document that data sufficient where you can give the data and the documentation to a third party, and without any information from the author, that they could reproduce that results, and they could use that data and use that analysis tool. So what do you have to do that? There's 3 major components. In the next slide, if you'll see the data is important, but the data documentation, you have to have a code book that explains that data, a README file that shows how to utilize all of these components, and the code itself. If you don't include the code itself, then it's much harder to understand if you're just reading a PDF that has been published in a journal. You really need to see the supporting or that context, as we talked about, the code book, the README, the analysis code, all of these things are context, and all of this has to be described and able to hand that description over to someone else to be able to use that. So next. We talked a little earlier about data security. In our world, in the social science world, this is really important. We have direct identifiers, people's names, social security numbers. Here it would be a CPF, phone numbers, things like that. But there are also many indirect things that are in the data that we know about these individuals that can identify them. So it's something that, especially in the area dealing with human subjects, is really important. If we're going to share this data, we need to deal with this data security. The next slide. So for many cases, many researchers just say, I'm not going to share the data. It's sensitive, I'm not going to share it. The challenge is more and more journals, more and more research organizations are asking to share the data, even if it's sensitive, but they want you to follow all the rules. So how do you do that? So how do we do that without violating our human subjects? There are many options out there. Many of them are growing every day, and these are getting stronger and stronger. Synthetic data, where the data is generated up similar to the real data, and you let someone access that synthetic data. Or differential privacy, where the data is, the term that I would use is clouded. Things are changed slowly in different areas of the data. So it's not the real data in some areas, but real data in other areas. So what we've done is clouded that data to make it where you couldn't figure things out efficiently who people are within that data. Or you can do cryptography or rules-based sharing using tools. So there are lots of new tools out there that are growing every day, and cryptography is a fairly new tool that people are starting to use. But I guess what I'd like to say is be sure that we are sharing that data, even if it has sensitive data, because there are ways to do that. Next. Early on, we talked about data citation, and we talked about how we give credit, and citation in the journals and in the print world is the way that happens. So how do you do that with data? It's really important to do this with data. There are many different principles. The Force 11 group came up with some really nice set of principles. They're starting to catch on. There's programs within Europe that are developing. As a program called Make Data Count that we're working with, where we can actually make that data a first-class citizen as we'd like to see it. So all the work that you do in sharing and managing that data, it gives you the credit for that data, and people don't abuse that data. They have to give you credit for it. So the next one. DOIs are real important. On the next slide, you'll see that they use DOIs, and there are other types of persistent identifiers, but DOIs are really strong. When I first started doing persistent identifiers, we used handles, and they worked very, very good. They did not seem to win the competitive battle. DOIs seem to be much more prolific these days, but some type of persistent identifier is really important to ensure that you can locate that data online. Next. I won't go into this in detail because the previous speakers talked about this, but in order to make these fair data and leverage the fair data principles, you must be findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable. The data has to be curated. It has to be placed under the care of someone who's going to manage it through time. It doesn't say findable today or tomorrow. It says findable for a long period of time. It's not something that goes away at the end of your project. It needs to be managed by groups who can manage that over the long period of time. So next. So how do you do this? So the key that what we've found is that work early in the research life cycle. Don't wait until you've already published the article and someone asks you to share the data, because many cases the research, your students or the other research assistants that have worked on the data, they're gone, they're on new projects, the funding's ended potentially, and you don't have the people around that can help create those metadata fields or can help describe that data. What we've done in many cases is embed an archivist or someone from the library within a research project early on to help do some of the proposal writing, plan about how you're going to manage that data, write a good data management plan up front and make it part of your timelines within your project. And then your data collection and during your analysis, data collection and analysis, you're ready to share towards the end of the project. All that metadata has been collected. So who should do all this stuff is a critical question. There's a lot of work involved here, and who's going to do this? So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about building a team. What does it take? So I feel it takes 4 components, 4 classes of people or groups of people. One is a content specialist. The content specialists could come from any discipline, right? They need to understand the contents of the data, understand what's important about the data to describe, do the analysis experts, the people who can do those different routines that are doing the different types of extractions or different types of geospatial analysis that may occur, for example, within the data. You need those people in order to help create fair data because they have to help you describe that data. You need metadata specialists who can actually catalog that data and make it data discoverable for other people outside the team. Those typically are within XML schemas, could be JSON, for example, could be RDF. You could create metadata crosswalks to different disciplines if you want to share with that within disciplines. But this is a type of a person who has studied how to do this efficiently. Then you also have your technology specialists. How do you manage this data through time? How do you preserve it through time? How do you be sure that the versions of that software are usable on the systems going through time? The database itself. How do you manage that database? How do you ensure that the database itself is preservable through time? And how do you index things within the database? Things are in the textual world. You have to index these text files as well. How do you make these things discoverable? That's another category of people that you need on your team. And of course, you need administrative support because all of this takes resources and coordinating. So I would highly recommend that at the beginning of any of your research projects, think about the team it would take to describe that data, to publish that data, to help you share that data. Don't just think about analyzing it for your paper because that's the first step. The challenge is later in the research cycle, you will be asked to share that data somewhere, whether with your other colleagues or even with yourself to redo that data analysis in a longitudinal study. And you'll need that documentation. It's critical that you have that documentation, and it takes several different categories of people, and those people reside all over the academic infrastructure, whether they be in research groups like mine, in the library and information systems, in your libraries, or in your research groups.